Last week, I spoke about fossils and how they actually fit into the Bible's story about Noah's flood much better than Darwinism's claim that they came from billions of years of gradual sedimentation. Fossils can only be formed if they got buried very quickly. The idea of a million years of gradual accumulation of sediment burying something just makes no sense. The thing is going to rot away or get eaten by something else within a few weeks or months. So if they know that all the fossils had to have been buried instantly, why do they think the rock layers are millions of years old? Again, I mentioned last time how they base everything off of an imaginary chart they call the geologic column that was made up by a guy in 1830. But it's never actually been seen in the ground. There's no question that the Earth does have distinct layers to it. But why do they say they represent millions of years? The various layers of strata in the Earth all came from Noah's flood. The flood was an entire year long, not just 40 days and 40 nights. And it wasn't just some tranquil, peaceful flood that just got things wet but didn't really destroy anything. It did a lot of damage. It left a lot of scars. The Earth we see today shows a lot of evidence for Noah's flood in many different places. But the problem is that we've all been so brainwashed by Darwinism that we've been tricked into misinterpreting all that evidence. Let's talk first about stratification. That means how the separate layers of the Earth got there. The textbooks taught us that they all came from millions of years of extremely gradual sedimentation, right? But that's not something that they can prove through observational experimentation. But it can be proven through observational experimentation how layers of sediment can actually form very quickly. Floods have happened and shown what I'm talking about. The waters stir up a bunch of various stuff, and it all quickly settles into distinct layers, just like the layers of the supposed geologic column. There's no reason to think that the little floods we see today can create sedimentary layers quickly, yet the layers of the geologic column must have been created very slowly over millions of years. That's not a scientific conclusion. It's just a false assumption based on their Darwinistic religious beliefs. And it actually contradicts what is actually observed scientifically. Based on observed science, it makes more sense that the layers of the Earth were created during Noah's flood, and that's why they're filled with a bunch of dead animals who were fossilized in the swimming position trying to escape the flood. Inside the Earth, one of the layers that you'll commonly find are layers of coal. Coal seams are found all over the place. I already mentioned how many times trees are found fossilized running through these coal seams. If coal takes millions of years to form, like the textbooks taught us, then how did a tree, which only takes decades to grow, end up running through an entire coal seam and running into another separate coal seam? Why do they think it takes millions of years for coal to form? It doesn't. You can buy bags of coalified wood at the store today to use in your outdoor grill. That stuff didn't take millions of years to form. They make it in a factory. All it takes is heat and pressure, not millions of years. I've got a great DVD of some guys who do an actual empirical experiment where they take a piece of wood, put it in water inside a metal tube, and put it in a high temperature oven for 2 weeks, and it comes out as coal. Coal comes from plant life. The layers of coal all came from the flood when all the plant life got buried. If you fly in an airplane over unpopulated areas and look out the window, you can see all sorts of evidence of water erosion. The ground just looks like it used to be covered with water. The mountains, the canyons, the deserts, they all show signs of water erosion. How does that happen to a desert like Arizona and New Mexico? Sometimes you find places where the rock layers are literally bent or scrunched up. There's no fracture lines where they bend. They were bent all at the same time while the rock was still soft. That couldn't have taken millions of years. And Noah's flood is the only possible explanation for something like this. There are also a lot of dried up waterfalls all over the planet. One of the biggest ones is called Dry Falls in Washington. There must have been a whole bunch of water all over the earth for there to have been all those waterfalls, don't you think? And speaking of waterfalls, let's talk about Niagara Falls. Did you know that they can measure how fast it's eroding? The waterfall slowly eats itself away backwards as it chews off rock from the top of the waterfall. They have pictures of where the edge of the waterfall used to be a long time ago. And we can see, of course, where it is today. Now, they've done things recently to try stopping the rate of erosion because it's such a huge tourist attraction. But before they did that, they were able to measure how fast it erodes. And guess what? It can only account for several thousand years of erosion, not millions. If the planet was billions of years old, the waterfall would already be fully eroded long ago. But the concept of Noah's flood happening only 4,400 years ago fits perfectly with the erosion rate of Niagara Falls. One of the biggest natural wonders on the planet is Grand Canyon. How did it get there? Where did it come from? I was taught when I was a kid that the Colorado River gradually carved out the Grand Canyon. And when you don't know any better, that explanation sounds believable. But that little river didn't carve out the Grand Canyon. That's literally impossible. First of all, think about this. The top of Grand Canyon is a mile wide. Do you think the Colorado River used to be a mile wide when it was first carving out the top of the canyon? The river at the bottom of the canyon right now is not even close to being a mile wide. Shouldn't the canyon only be as wide as the river is? It should be a Grand Slot, not Grand Canyon. But that's not the real evidence that proves it impossible. Here's the real evidence. The Grand Canyon cuts right through a large hill called the Kaibab Uplift. It literally rises in elevation on one side of the canyon and lowers in elevation on the other side. Now think this through. Before the Grand Canyon started being formed by the Colorado River, the river would have had to literally flow uphill for the first half of the canyon before it could start flowing back downhill again on the other side of the Kaibab Uplift. Rivers don't flow uphill, ever. And there's no evidence that the uplift happened afterwards. The rock layers aren't bent that way. This is conclusive proof that the Colorado River could not have carved out that canyon. And that's the only explanations Darwinists have. So how did it get there then? It makes much more sense to believe that it came after Noah's flood. When the planet was covered with water, all the layers were formed at the same time and were still soft. As the flood waters slowly went down, there was a huge lake that formed over New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. But as the waters continued going further down, that lake eventually breached its border, and all the water rushed out like a broken dam. The water followed the path of least resistance and ended up carving out the wet, soft sediments of what is now called the Grand Canyon. It could have taken weeks for all that water to drain out, hence the huge size of the canyon. After the lake drained, the rock layers eventually dried up and hardened. Now, does that just sound too crazy? Does it sound like just a wacky theory with no real evidence to back it up? Well, it's not, because we've seen it happen elsewhere. Where? In Washington in 1980, when Mount St. Helens erupted. The exact same thing happened there too. The eruption blocked off the Toutle River, and the waters backed up to form a lake. Eventually, that lake breached its border and spilled out through a notch, which quickly formed a canyon, literally overnight. That's empirical science, people. Darwinists just guess that the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River with no actual observational evidence for it. Creationists say the Grand Canyon was formed as the result of a huge flood, and we have actual observational evidence for it. There's so much empirical evidence for creationism by looking at the geology of the planet that I didn't get to all the topics I said I would last week. I'll get to carbon dating and petrification next week.